Redefining Burnout Conversations with Dr. Adeola Mead. We're super excited to have this conversation today. I am Julie Pham. I am the CEO and founder of Curiosity Base. We help people practice curiosity in the world, starting in the workplace, because that is where we spend most of our waking hours. I like to have conversations with leaders who are focused on workplace communication and workplace wellness. And so I'm really excited about this conversation today with my new friend, Dr. Adeola Mead. And so what we'll do is I'm going to ask Dr. Mead to describe herself, to give a little bio, why you're so passionate about what you do. And then I've got these questions around redefining, identifying burnout, what organizations and employers can do about it, and also what individuals can do about it. And there's going to be definitely opportunities for you, the audience, to send in your questions. And the way you do that is you can just go to there's a ask questions window. And then as the questions come in, we can answer them, especially if I may have a little pause so that Dr. Mead can finish her thoughts. Otherwise, we'll just answer the questions as they come in. So with that, Dr. Mead, super excited for you to be here with us. And I just first want to understand, I know that you approach burnout as a holistic doctor. And so I'd like to understand how you got into this and why you're so passionate about burnout?
Sure. Thank you so much, Julie, for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about this with you in particular, because I know this is something that's important for you too. So I'm a naturopathic physician. So my background is in primary care with a focus on non-pharmaceutical treatments. So addressing ailments holistically, so mind, body, spirit, and using natural methods to do that. So I've been practicing now for 15 years and came out to Bastyr here in Kenmore, Washington to go to school. And my life really changed because of this exposure to this community of people who saw health as more than just this reductionist form of, an algorithm that says, well, if you have this, then you take this. And that's that. It's more like, who is the person with the symptoms? So that really resonated with me because my background is in biology, but I'm from Nigeria and I come from a family where our culture and our medicine is very much holistic and communal and, plant-based as far as like medicine and food. So it made a lot of sense to move into this sort of medicine. And why I am
and actually, I'd love for you to share. I remember when we had a conversation, you said your brother actually helped introduce you to it, and you're like, and so can you share that story, please?
Sure. Yeah. So I had always wanted to be a doctor. That was just my thing. My mom said that before even I can remember, my grandparents would be sick and I'd say, don't worry, I'm your doctor. I'm going to take care of you. And I would just like get, leaves and things and make them medicine with, a 2-year-old's kind of medicine and give it to them and declare them healed. And that was just my singular thought was I'm going to be a doctor. And I always wanted to be an obstetrician because I love babies. I still do. And I thought, well, who's closest to babies? An obstetrician. And was going along that route and taking MCATs and was just going to become a doctor, become an obstetrician. And I remember I visited my brother who was living in LA at the time. And he and my dad had been working on a project to source natural materials to make herbal medicine in Nigeria. So they would source it and then send it to like herbal companies here. So they knew naturopaths who worked in these companies. So he thought, well, have you thought about naturopathic medicine? And I'm like, well, what's that? And he just sent me to the website. So I'm scrolling through and like, of course. Well, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm doing. And he's like, that is not what you're doing. That is not the path you're on. This is very different. I thought, well, okay, well, then this is the path I'm on now because it just resonated so deeply. Yeah. So he just shared one website with me and I thought, well, I've arrived. This is where I need to be.
That's so interesting because, this conversation is about redefining. And so we can have certain definitions in our mind of what it means to be a doctor. And you thought that was what it meant. And he was just, no, let me tell you that that's not the kind of doctor you're going to become if you're staying on this path. And so how much definitions and understanding can be to just the work and just, if you hadn't had that clarity, then who knows what you'd be doing today.
Yeah. And who knows if it would really resonate with who I am, right?
Mhm.
And like my background and my lineage, like this just follows so smoothly and makes so much sense to me that even if there are days where I'm just like, oh man, my schedule looks ridiculous, or this is a difficult case, or this is a difficult scenario to work through, I know at my core that this is such a big part of who I am and what I'm meant to do. So I find the strength somehow to power through, and it's always rewarding. Even if I'm tired, it's still rewarding. So I think that
Mhm.
makes a huge difference, and we'll talk about that a little bit more too.
So how'd you get to burnout as being you're passionate about preventing burnout?
Yeah. So one of the tenets of naturopathic medicine is treat the cause. So this is something that you're always doing. If someone comes in with, a constellation of symptoms, I'll say, then you want to always look at, okay, how are these things related? Is there an underlying root cause? Can we treat at that level? So for years, I practiced in Seattle. I practiced in the interior of BC, in Kamloops, BC. I practiced in Vancouver, BC. I practiced in San Francisco. So my patients were often kind of high achieving tech workers for the most part, like high achieving, tech workers, business workers, entrepreneurs, um, often women, some were moms, so juggling motherhood, family life, wifedom, sisterhood, all the hats that women wear, and just spreading themselves really thin. And then when the pandemic started, I started doing this deeper work with a 40-day program that really constituted so much of what I had done with individuals over time, but just put it into clinical care and coursework that help with self-care and accountability, because I found that over time, this is what makes the biggest difference. So I packaged it into this whole program, and the people who were attracted to it were women who were high achievers, wearing lots of hats, spreading themselves thin. And I've done this with individuals and also with the group now. And every time, usually within like 2, 3 weeks, whatever health concerns people would come in with, they'd start saying, oh, well, my blood pressure is down now and it's pretty stable. My digestion is way better. My skin is cleared up. But now I'm going to quit my job. And okay. There was always this like really big
Huh.
sort of professional transition that would happen, where my understanding was that they finally had some bandwidth, right? Like it's really
Mhm.
hard to ask yourself the big questions about what you want to do with your life if you're always in pain or if you're always
Mhm.
uncomfortable. It's really distracting to be in physical, mental, emotional discomfort at all times. So when we're working clinically and they were also implementing self-care practices, that just kind of cleared that off of their slate a little bit so they could step back and take a breath and say, this isn't working for me. And it was just happening often enough that I thought, I don't want to be the reason these organizations are losing this, what I would consider top
Mhm.
talent, but this is necessary for them because they didn't feel like they could be well in the spaces that they were in professionally.
Mm.
So that was the next step for them, and I really respect that and admire those steps. But I thought, well, if organizations had this sort of care or insight, then maybe they could retain more talent. So that made me start kind of looking into how these people were becoming burnt out, what the struggles were within these organizations, how they were finding healing, and then making decisions from there when they felt better. And I just became very passionate about treating the cause, because I talked to a colleague last week about working more at this space, and she said she doesn't know how many patients she tells, quit your job and then come back. I can't help you until you're out of this environment. And that's
Mm.
kind of across the board for, I think, a lot of holistic healers, is that people come in and they're dealing with these like laundry lists of chronic conditions, and it often stems from this chronic stress at work. And there's just so much you can do to band-aid them until that chronic stress is alleviated. So that's, I guess, why I'm passionate about it, is because I feel very strongly about treating a cause. When you treat the cause, the symptoms start to dissipate on their own. So you're not like putting out symptom fires of, elbow pain and digestive disorder and depression. If you're able to create an environment where an individual can really thrive on many levels, then a lot of those chronic conditions go away. And that's where my focus always is.
That's so interesting because I often think about how in the workplace people are feeling tired. It's like, okay, well, let me just take a couple of days off or
Mhm.
go on a vacation, which by the way, I totally think there's a difference between vacation and rest. And so, and and yet that doesn't actually address the cause.
No. And a lot of times, and that's what burnout is. It's what characterized by fatigue that isn't helped by rest or sleeping, right? Like it's a deep, deep fatigue because you haven't really gotten away from the problem or the cause of your fatigue or your exhaustion. So there's a big difference. And there are different types of rest too, right?
Mm.
There's social rest, there's physical rest, there's mental emotional rest, there's environmental rest. There's so many different types of rest, and each person needs a different kind at different times. So there's a lot of nuance as to what is restful for one person as opposed to another and what's appropriate at different times too.
Mm. So, audience, please, as if you have any questions, just type that in and we'll address them as we go along. I now want to ask you, Dr. Mead, how do people then typically think about burnout, and how do you define it, and how do you identify it?
Sure. So there's no like medical diagnosis of burnout. There's no like ICD-10 code, but there is one for stress and different conditions. But the World Health Organization has a definition of a syndrome that is chronic workplace stress that's not been successfully managed. Right. So I read this article in Harvard Business Review about how this is like a new definition with the World Health Organization. But the problem is that chronic workplace stress was it has always been a problem. It's not a new thing. It's just that once there were over so many layers overlapping during the pandemic that really became more prevalent, and something that more people were suffering from in ways that they couldn't hide it anymore. So it's just not been successfully managed. But at the same time, like there's an organizational responsibility and there's an individual responsibility. So how you can successfully manage it looks different for different people, but there are, general ways that it can be addressed so that it is, more holistic. The problem is that it hasn't been addressed in a holistic way in so many spaces, in organizations and for individuals.
Hmm. So I'm thinking about what you just said makes me think about how we it's been around for a long time, and yet diagnosing it, calling it burnout
Mhm.
actually then elevates the importance of it. And you said that during the pandemic it became so many more people are experiencing it, and that's where it's just, oh, we actually have to address this. I mean, do you think that actually there was a lot of burnout before that people just dealt with?
Yeah, I mean, I think people just figured it was normal. I'm just
Mm.
work, 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 work. I'll get exhausted. If I get too exhausted, then I'll quit this job. I'll try something else. I'll torpedo my life and start over somewhere. Like that's just what happens. And I think with the pandemic, there was just so many more layers of that stress. So there was the workplace stress that didn't go away and probably didn't change in a lot of organizations, but then parents were having to deal with childcare. And then there
Mhm.
was isolation. And then there was just like the existential anxiety about what is going on in our world. Like everything shifted so much that it just came to a place where, you know, people just couldn't go further, right? And there was now like more conversation around mental health as well. So I think it became more prevalent for people to talk about it, hopefully a little bit more, not in every space, but to just be aware that okay, this is a problem and it can't continue. So I think that's a positive thing that's come out of the pandemic and people having time and space to pause to reflect a little bit more.
Mm. So is there a line of just, I'm just feeling tired today versus this is burnout? Or like I'm feeling like, how do you know when, oh, this is definitely, I'm feeling burnout?
Yeah. So you technically can identify it because it has three hallmark symptoms, shall we say. So there's that fatigue that is just like not going away no matter what you do. And then there's for occupational burnout, there's like the cynicism around work, like basically like I don't trust this leadership, this organization. I don't feel like I belong here. I don't trust this whole scene. And then the last one is inefficiency. So you can just imagine like you're exhausted. You don't even know if you really align with this work in the space. So you're not going to do your job as well. I feel like that one makes a lot of sense. It's like I don't really want to be here. So I'm less effective at doing what I'm doing because kind of my heart isn't in it anymore. So those are the hallmark signs, right?
Mm. I've heard of the first and the third make sense to me. I hadn't thought about just distrust in leadership as being a sign of being burnt out too.
Yeah.
So I see some questions coming in from the audience. And so I see from Kylie, what would you say is the opposite of burnout, and how would you recognize it when you're in that more positive space?
That's a great question. So you may or may not be familiar with the Maslach burnout inventory, but this is this great
I am not.
tool.
So,
That might be like when you're like elbow deep in burnout research, but it's this great tool that helps you determine if you are really burnt out. And it's a bit of a spectrum, right? As far as like the workplace experience for employees. So on one end, it's engaged. You feel positive about your work. So think about those three hallmark signs. You're not exhausted. You have a positive idea or perception of the organization that you're in, and you're doing your job pretty well. So that's like you're engaged, you're here, you're in it. Next would be just one of those signs. So maybe you're not doing your work as well. So you're just like ineffective, right? So professionally ineffective, but you're not exhausted. You don't mistrust your organization, but you're just kind of ineffective. So that's one category, shall we say. And there are different ways to address each category. So those are two. And then the next is you just don't trust this whole scene, right? Like you're
mhm,
not exhausted, you're not, ineffective, but you're scoring pretty high, and this is a mismatch value-wise for me, and I'm not feeling aligned. And
mhm,
then there's just the exhausted. You are overextended. This is way too much work. Um, it's just way too much work, and maybe the other aspects aren't there, but you're overextended. So in that space, you could have like a really good long vacation and come back renewed and rejuvenated. That could be a solution there. And then there's burnout, where you're hitting all of the check marks, right? You're exhausted. This is not a great match for you ideologically or value wise, and you're not doing well. So that's how you know that you're at a space where something's got to give. So for Kylie's question, if you're on that part of the spectrum where you are aligned with the mission and values of the organization, you have energy to put into your work, and you're doing it well, then you know that you are not burnt out, and you're kind of far away on the spectrum to burnout.
mm. Thank you, Dr. Mead.
Sure.
So, oh, and there are all of these comments that are coming in about needing to stop glamorizing hustle culture, and that in the U.S. downtime and balance is not valued. Other countries get time off, and then includes at the executive level, but it's not okay to talk about it generally. I actually often hear people tell me how leaders will say, take the time you need, and yet they're also just, and check, I'm available on email if you need me during vacation,
Oh yeah.
right? So let's go to this. What can employers and organizations do
Yeah.
about preventing burnout?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a common framework that works both for organizations and individuals. And I would say it's to implement a consistent routine of reflection, reevaluation, and realignment. So for an organization, I would say that that means asking, well, a few things. First is to be really clear in identifying the mission and values of your organization and articulating them all the time to your people, right? So that people know that when they're part of this organization, this is what we're about. This is where we put our money and our time. This is why we do what we do. So that they can know when they're coming in every day or when they're coming to the organization that they're aligned with it or not. So that's one. The next is to, you know, act in alignment with those values. And that's where sometimes things get muddy, right? Like you could have lots of branding and organization about what we're here for and what we do, but leadership, does not walk that talk. And that is a real problem. And that's where a lot of cynicism comes from. And that's where there's a lot of double standards, right? Like you take a time off, focus on your, mental health. I had this one, I did this, I was on a panel with an organization, and it was all these like really senior professionals in the organization talking about how they cope and how they manage the different responsibilities. And one person said that they were on a leave, but they would be up in the middle of the night sometimes, just up, and they would just check their email, and they would do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And, they said, I don't expect other people to do that. And I'm just sitting here thinking, of course they're going to do that, especially if they're new. So many people started their career at the beginning of the pandemic. So they've never been in office before. They've never been mentored. They might even really know their job, but they opened their computer at, I remember the lines of work and not work got really blurred during the pandemic for a lot of people too, especially when you're new. So maybe they're opening their computer at 6 in the morning when they wake up, or 7 in the morning, and they see that their supervisor was on at 3 in the morning. Like that really skews their expectations of what they're supposed to do. They can't talk to you about it like, oh, am I supposed to be up at 3 as well? No one's going to ask you that, but that expectation has been modeled. And now that's like a great psychological stress. And then they're going to push themselves likely harder because they think that that's what is required to be successful here. Um, so that's an important part of walking the talk. So reflecting, asking for feedback, just asking questions. How is this going? Is this working? Are we living the values, and really acting on that feedback too. A lot of times, if you want to build trust, you need to do those surveys, ask for feedback, but then you have to act on it. Otherwise, it's really frustrating. I don't know how many surveys people have taken and feedback, little questionnaires, and then they hear nothing. Why are we doing this? It'd be helpful for that to be, explicit. Why are we doing the survey? What's going to happen after we're done? And a lot of times organizations and leaders aren't clear about that. So asking for feedback, acting on feedback, and really modeling as leaders what it means to be in this organization, to be, and what it means to be successful, and what it looks like to be successful, and making sure that that's a human-centered place. I think we forget, because we're an organization, we have org charts, that these are just people. We're all just people. We all have, struggles and challenges. And you would never tell someone in another setting, like, oh, you should probably, check your email in the middle of the night and when you're vacation. You never tell a friend that, you never tell your mom that. But when it's this organization, it's like, well, our number one goal, what you're saying by, acting that way, or just making that little side note, is that our number one goal here is productivity. It's not your well-being. It's not the well-being of this organization. It's just getting ahead. And that is harmful for relationships, professional and, personal relationships. So I'd say just asking for feedback, acting on it, and then leading by example.
Mm. So what you're saying, Dr. Mead, it personally resonates with me. Actually, we just had this conversation yesterday on my team where someone had been sick, and we said take some time off, and then they pointed out, well, you worked when you were sick. And I was like, oh yeah, I did, but it was just my voice. I felt okay, right? And so I just realized, wow, what I do, people do what you do, not what you say you do.
Yes.
And so for me to be mindful of that, and I have to tell you, I use the schedule send on Slack and email so often now. So it doesn't, people are not getting emails from me at all times a day, but I
Yes.
can still work the way that I want to, when I want to work. And at the same time, they're not getting the anxiety of, oh, she sent an email at 11 p.m. or something like that.
Yeah.
It is hard though, of just being mindful of, oh, what I do, people are that's gonna send signals. So
Yeah. And I think it is harder as a leader because people are watching you very closely. Like you're not called a leader unless people are following you, then you're just a person. But if people are following you, then you're a leader. And there's a lot of pressure on leaders to perform, to be really productive, to move the organization forward, to mentor. There's a very unique set of expectations on leaders, but we just have to remember too to find a balance there, right? To make sure that you are also centering yourself and your well-being, and making sure that those values are aligned with that of the organization.
yeah, so because it makes me think about how there's another layer of responsibility here in the modeling. So I see a question from Maria. How do you tackle a situation where you have a manager who is almost promoting this hustle culture, saying you should be available all the time and almost leading people to burnout?
Mhm.
I've had this in my past and have realized how much of an impact a manager can have on your well-being.
Yeah, so that's a hard one. If you cannot talk to that manager in a way that is open and honest, or even just to reflect back, here's something that you said, and I need you to know some of the impact that it's having. And I think sometimes people get defensive if you are, if they feel like you are attacking them, like you shouldn't have done this and you shouldn't have done that. But it's easier if you can be reflective back. Like you said that, what did you say? That you should be available all the time, but that's actually pretty damaging to mental health, like that no one can be on all the time. Like we are all here to promote the success of this organization, but that is not that's not a healthy expectation. And we would love to contribute as much as possible, but that's just not something that is possible. Or if you have examples of, people who have gone that far, or you've gone that far, and it was a detriment to your personal health. It's so tricky with managers and your relationships and your dynamics with them. But if you or a group of peers had an opportunity to talk to this person, if you felt like they'd be amenable, or someone else that you trust in an organization to get that message across, I think it's really important that safe spaces are created so that people can have their voices heard and to feel seen. And if that is not the culture of the organization, then that is an underlying problem. That's also a root cause, right? So when something is wrong, you don't know how you can course correct, you don't have anyone to talk to. That is a surefire way to build a burnout culture. And it's going to be detrimental in the long run, both for individuals and for the organization.
Thank you. Could you give an example of an organization you've worked with that actually was able to go from that burnout, creating burnout among their employees, to making those small changes and maybe moving a little more on that spectrum, a little more to the engaged part?
Yeah. I worked with an organization that had done some surveys, and they, kept hearing feedback back like, this is relentless, people are starting to burn out. So that's why they reached out to me for some support. So we did some more like definitive surveys on where people were at, where they could use some support. And it's nice to check boxes, but it's even better to have people explain exactly where they're at so that you really have more contextual data. So they, implemented a workplace well-being program. So there's some learning opportunities, and they took all that information back and started to see the trends, right? So more people are talking about this. Some people are talking more about their managers, and wanted to just bring in more communication. So open up some of those safe spaces. And then also like with in collaboration with myself and my team, had like one-to-one sessions with each person to figure out like really what was going on with them and how could they move forward in their individual well-being. But then to get that feedback back to them, like all in all confidentiality, but there are several people who would benefit from this and several people who would benefit from that. So they started with just like listening, and went into like more deeper active listening, a little bit more acting on individual needs,
Mm.
and then started to implement some of the information they learned by looking at those trends.
Mm. I know that one of the services that you offer is being the incremental chief wellness officer, and so I never heard that before, and I really love that, and just how helping even just organizations do that surveying. So April's question actually leads us well to that last part we want to get to. What are your favorite strategies for a healthier work-life harmony? And so this is about, well, so this they're what employers and organizations can do. What can individuals do?
Yeah. So my number one tool for a better work-life harmony is to tap into self-awareness practices, right? I think sometimes we are human doings as opposed to human beings, and we really need to remember that we are um, yeah, we're selves in context, right? Like you're not the same self at work that you are at home. So you have to see yourself in those contexts and really reflect on, okay, who am I in this context? What are the expectations that I have for myself or others have for me? Am I able to meet those? If not, why not? Is there some way that I can communicate where there's a gap between what I can do and what's being expected of me? And just continuously revisiting like who am I in this space? What are the expectations? And finding ways to bridge those gaps. So yeah, lots of self-awareness. What's going right? What's not going well? What could I have done differently here? Is there someone I can communicate with differently in this space? Is there someone else I need to talk to have this goal? But if we don't ever stop to reflect on who we really are at our core, and how we are showing up in this space occupationally, or even just like relationships. I mean, there's all different types of burnout. There's occupational burnout, there's relational burnout, there's, you know, childcare burnout, caregiving burnout, and compassion fatigue, and things like that. So stepping back to reflect on self and also values and purpose. Like, what are your core values? For example, I had a patient whose one of her core values is punctuality. That was really surprising to me. I thought she was going to say kindness, but she did say kindness, but you don't hear that. So she was able to reflect, I really value punctuality. So now she makes sure she's even just a few minutes early to all of her meetings. And even if everyone else is late, she feels good about herself because she's acting in alignment with her core values. And I think those little, identifications of who you are, what your values are, what you feel like your purpose is, maybe in life or maybe just in this space, like, what is my purpose in this role? Am I trying to reach this benchmark, make these deadlines, get noticed, or am I trying to also, or additionally, be a good friend to my colleagues, bring about social change, bring more equity? Why are you here? And even if not everything is going great, in those spaces, if you are really tapped into that sense of purpose of why you're here, whether it really has to do with your deliverables or not, then I think you'd find a reason every day to get in there and work towards those goals and that sense of alignment.
Mm.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So yes, I want to comment on that. But before I do, though, I just want to invite the audience for any last questions that you want to pose to Dr. Mead, just to put that in the chat. And so, just what you said about all those different types of burnout,
Mhm.
compassion fatigue versus relational. It's so helpful to even just be aware of it, because otherwise we're just, it's burnout.
Yeah.
I'm tired
Yeah.
and I need to do this, and then we actually can't really pinpoint the cause of it, as you're saying. It's just to understand what the cause is and to ask myself, what is causing this?
Right.
So, mhm.
Yeah. And I think of burnout as just like this emergency brake in your life. Like you're out of gas. You cannot keep going this way. And there's just like this misalignment between who you are and what your values and purpose are and what you're doing. And I think of it as like, let's say you have a destination in mind, right? And maybe you have a map. Maybe you created the map or an organization did, and they're like, this is how you get from A to B, or society has, this is how things are done. But you have your destination in mind. Maybe you have a map, but you don't have a compass that you consult. So you don't course correct, and you're just going, you're charging, you're trying to get to this place, even if it's, something that you think you're supposed to do, and where you end up instead is burnout. The destination is burnout because you just haven't
Mm,
kind of used that internal compass. Like, is this the way I need to go? Is this the way I need to do it to honor myself and my purpose and my sense of values? Not exactly. So let me course correct and change this a little bit, or talk to someone about how this is just not going to work for me. But we need to find that internal compass for ourselves, and then as you course correct, implement some form of self-care. Like, what's appropriate here? Do I need to take some time off? Do I need to, a lot of my work is in the physical, mental, emotional um, disease that comes from just this ongoing like exertion that's not aligned, right? So it's like, do I need to eat differently, or spend time in nature, or build my community? A lot of times burnout happens when we feel like we're in a vacuum. We're alone, we're going it alone, there's no one to talk to. You feel that kind of isolation. It happens a lot for leaders because it's like, I can't, let them see me sweat, and or I can't let my colleagues see me sweat. I can't let people down. So you feel like you're alone, but we're never alone. We can always tap into some sort of community or build some sort of community. So just community, I think, is a big part of self-care, like supportive, therapeutic community, therapeutic self-care, and those habits that just make it so we have more capacity and that sense of like clarity and who I am and what I'm doing here, but consistent reevaluation of those things. So you are investing in your overall capacity.
So, two things are coming to mind here. Is just, how often do we travel without having a knowledge of our internal compass?
Yeah.
And so that we'll just get lost if we don't have that internal compass. And the
Mhm.
other thing, what you're saying about loneliness and about being in community, I just finished reading Dr. Vivek Murthy's Together, the healing power of human connection in a sometimes lonely world. And he talks about how loneliness is actually the cause of many public health epidemics. And so what you're saying really resonates with that. So I see a question from Tanika, and this is, are women more burned out than men? What demographic of patients do you treat, Dr. Mead?
Yeah, I would say yes, in a lot of ways. Women, because we function differently in society and we have different expectations of us, right? So women are often primary caregivers. We're just wearing a lot of hats. And especially if you're also in a corporate space or an entrepreneur, like you're pushing yourself really, really hard. And sometimes you're dealing with inequities too in those spaces. So it just feels like this slog sometimes. So I feel like yeah, without support and without that sense of being seen and feeling heard, that it's more common for women to reach that place of burnout. And then also to be kind of chastised by society. It's just like, oh, you couldn't do it all. And it's just like this like never-ending cycle of being just a human who has natural limits, but having these astronomical expectations, and that gap is where we end up getting burnout. So I see a lot of women who circle around burnout and maybe sometimes end up in burnout and then need to restore function physically, mentally, emotionally, mentally, and then also in the spaces that they're in professionally, like find that space. Like I think April was saying that some companies, for example, will have meetingless Fridays, which are great, walking meetings, self-care days, PTO. So finding that balance, taking FMLA sometimes too, um, staying connected with managers and staying in communication, so you have like an advocate, having a mentor, someone who will just like speak for you when you're feeling too exhausted to speak for yourself, like all those senses of community and sort of building that human centered culture, I think make a big difference. But without that, then I think yes, women often will suffer more, like just because of so many different demands on women.
Yes, and April just wrote, there's found no one way to hit burnout or to heal from it. Yes, and that really gets at that individual trying to the self-awareness part that you were talking about, Dr. Mead, right? What's causing this, and then how do I heal from it? Because it's not just about going on vacation.
No, and we have to remember too that we bring our whole selves into the spaces we go into. Some people might have a lower tolerance for stress because of a history of trauma, or even just like genetically having like a constitution that's more likely to get ill or more likely to spike cortisol. So and these are not things that we can necessarily control, right? Like this is just part of who we are. So we have to remember that for some people it might take what looks like a lot less to get burnt out, and for other people's they might be able to go much further and then get burnt out. But the fact is that we are not all at the same place. We don't start at the same place when we start day one in your organization. Not everyone has the same capacity. We have to remember to have compassion for ourselves and offer grace to ourselves and others, because we bring our whole selves into all these spaces.
And that's making me think about how employers and managers need to remember that too, that not all of, because sometimes they're like, well, why aren't they performing as well as that person? And they don't have these tough of conditions, and why are they feeling burnt out earlier? So, so with that, our time is coming up, Dr. Mead, and I just want to make sure that people have a chance to get in touch with you. And I know you have some offerings here. And so I know that Michaela is going to put on the screen some ways to stay in contact with you.
Great. Yeah. So I have an ebook that focuses on some of the major like physical concerns that I see when people are nearing or already at a stage of burnout. So mood imbalances, low energy and fatigue, and digestive disturbance. So this gives you some tips on how to start to address those things on your own, and then see them all improved kind of simultaneously with some self-care and some tips around that. So there's like a hyperlink on that, or there's a QR code. Thanks, Michaela. So you can scan the QR code and get access to that. So that's one thing. And then the other one is I've started doing my my 40-day intensive program in groups, which has been just such a positive experience, just for accountability, and just to be on the journey, right? Like I said, like community is part of self-care. So It's a 40-day program, and I've called it Operation Prioritize Me, because I think a lot of times we just prioritize everything and everyone else, and we're in the shadows, and then we suffer for it. So it's got coaching. I'm teaming up with someone who is here, Lola McCann. She's an executive coach, and she's going to be sharing during group sessions aspects on positive intelligence, and then we'll be implementing self-care together, and anti-inflaming our lives, right? So nutrition and lifestyle and natural medicine, and then also with our mindset too, with the help of Lola McCann. And I'm just really excited about that. So there's a QR code there, and you can check it out too. And I just love to support people in ways that are meaningful for them.
And is that the one that you can do in cohorts too? Because I know that you do some cohort work.
Yeah, I just finished a cohort on Tuesday, and the next one is going to start mid-May. I think it's like May 19th or May 12th. I don't remember, but it's on the website. So yeah, we'll be doing another one soon.
Because I know that can really help in terms of accountability. So, and then also you still do the incremental Chief Wellness Officer working with organizations too?
Yeah, so it's fractional. So
Oh,
it's just kind of yeah,
fractional.
so it's kind of as needed, figuring out what's the root cause of some of the issues. And a lot of times it's like burnout or high turnover or low productivity, or just really wanting to focus on well-being. So I'd go in and maybe do some surveys and figure out what is the root cause here, and how can we meet people where they're at, and still give that individualized care. So I will meet with team members or leadership one-on-one to figure out, where are you at, and how can we improve your capacity to really serve in this space in a way that's meaningful for you and meaningful for the organization. So yes, I do still take on fractional chief wellbeing officer work.
Great. And then this last offer, can you explain what happens in the consult?
Yeah, so it's really just meeting where you're at. Like, where are you or your organization? Like, if this is something that you want to prioritize for your team, and how we can partner together. So I'm just always happy to share resources. I have a pretty good network, a building network. So just lots of people in the well-being space, coaching space, executive, um, you know, coaching spaces. So there's just so many things that people do that I'm learning all the time. So I can say this would be a really great fit for you, and connecting people with resources. So it's just an opportunity to brainstorm what the next steps would be.
Mm. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that, because and it sounds like if you don't have the answer, you know someone who does and who can really, and you can guide them in that right position, that right direction. So with that, thank you so much, audience, for being here with us today for this conversation on redefining burnout. And this has been part of Curiosity Base, our conversations with leaders. So please connect with us. Please subscribe to our weekly newsletter and follow us on social media. And that way you'll get announcements about interesting conversations like this. So thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mead, for this conversation. I have walked away with lots of practical strategies as both as an employer and also as an individual.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Julie. This is really fun.